Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, Episode 37, General Blake and General Cuesta of the Royal Spanish Army. We have a special guest with us today, all the way from London, Josh Provan from Adventures in Historyland. Say hello, Josh.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, no, my audience will be super enthused because we are branching off from our usual Russian generals, British generals, and French generals, and we're going to talk about a different group of generals in the Napoleonic Wars, correct?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Spanish generals in this episode, and for those of you not familiar with Josh, he has a brilliant Adventures in Historyland YouTube page, as well as a blog, as well as a Twitter page. Can you kind of tell us what Adventures in Historyland is about real quick, Josh?
Adventures in Historyland can be used as code for the muddled mind of Lando. Lando being my alter ego,
right?
That I collected during the pandemic years, because of Land of History, because I'm at Land of History on Twitter. And it's just a place I go where I want to do a bit of time traveling, really.
Yeah, and there's some brilliant, especially on the YouTube page, some brilliant videos on there. So if my audience is interested, I mean, just all kinds of topics on there, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I cover anything from ancient history right down to just before and into the First World War. I specialize kind of in the 18th and 19th centuries, I guess, but I'll go anywhere.
Okay. Well, I recommend my audience check it out and check out your Twitter page as well. For this episode, we're going to talk about two generals of the Spanish Royal Army, and we're going to talk about Blake and Cuesta, who are, I think, two interesting guys, don't you?
Yeah, they're very interesting guys, and I'm glad you used the term Royal Army here, because there's kind of a difference as time goes on during the Peninsular War. You start off with the old Royal Army, and then it becomes the newer army after that one fades away.
Yeah, and there's generalissimos, there's bandit chieftains. It's kind of a guerrilla war after a while, don't you think?
Oh yes, absolutely. It's classically thought of as a guerrilla war. And since we're talking about Spanish generals, let's just quickly be really pedantic here and tell all the listeners that, technically speaking, a guerrilla is a big ape, and
right.
a guerrilla is the partisan.
Yep, the small war. Yep.
Exactly. But nobody, I mean, it's guerrilla in the English vernacular. People understand what it is. We're not going to be pedantic about it. I just like to tell people that.
Yeah, no, some people, may not know that. So I'm glad we pointed that out. Well, let's discuss the Peninsular War as a whole very briefly. I know it was a 6-year battle, basically from 1807, to 1813, 1814, depending on when you want to talk about the Spanish part of it. I know Napoleon invaded Portugal first, and then Spain. What do you think the biggest challenge for the Allies was, or against Napoleon? Why do you think why did it take 6 years to evict him from the peninsula?
Oh, so many reasons. Okay, the biggest challenge, I guess, overall would be the fact that you're fighting a war in a country that had essentially ceased to exist and was being rebuilt as aid arrived in the form of what was an ancient enemy in terms of what the Spanish point of view. They were old enemies of the British.
Right.
And massive decentralization. You had political unity was non-existent in Spain. The idea of popular war in itself is something of a myth. Like, not everybody wanted to rise up and fight the French. Lots of these sorts of themes are why it took so long to get anywhere.
Right, and not only that, the king and his court were basically imprisoned by Napoleon, so there was no head of state other than Joseph Bonaparte, who obviously was working for his brother. So there really was no central government in place. I'm glad you pointed that out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole hilarious and tragic road, I should say, to this war is a very fascinating story with the political movements, with the king, his son Manuel Godoy, Napoleon's hatred of all the Bourbons.
Yep.
The coup that allows him to take control of the Spanish royal family and just spirit them away to Bayonne.
Yep.
It's amazing.
And it was really a comedy of errors, not only on the royal family part, but eventually Napoleon and his marshals as well. But we'll get into that. We're first going to discuss Spanish General Blake, who strikes me as an unlucky character, similar to Marshal MacDonald on the French side. What do you think about the general's overall abilities?
Blake, as a commander, I think his name is Joaquín Blake, actually.
Correct.
He was a long-serving soldier. He had quite a long title.
Mm-hmm.
But as commander of the Army of Galicia, he can be construed as, I guess, a poor general.
Mm-hmm.
I did a video with Charles Esdale, who is the leading English authority on the Peninsular War, and he very sort of frankly said that, Spain did not produce a Wellington or a Napoleon. All of its generals they never reached beyond a certain level.
Right.
And Blake is one of these guys. We should remember that the means at his disposal as well.
Right.
And the lack thereof only encouraged his instinct for caution.
Right.
And no Spanish general commanded a force that had the money, training, or experience of the French army they were going to face.
In fairness to, Blake and Cuesta and the whole Spanish army was going against, armies that had defeated the Prussians and the Austrians. Soult was a great general, as was Suchet, as was Victor. And, there were some good generals he was up against. So it's not like he was fighting some amateurs out there.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, what was it Wellington said right before he went over to Portugal? He was talking about how the French had been excellent soldiers the last time he'd ever seen them in Flanders. And like he said, 10, 15 years of victory under Bonaparte probably has made them better. And that's the army that the Spanish now have to deal with.
Right. A very tough army. So as we get into Blake, I read that he was of Irish descent and he was born in Spain in August 1759 to an aristocratic family. Do we know much about his early life growing up?
As much as any Spanish general is known, and that's very little in English, to be honest. We sort of know, like you say, his background ish as an aristocratic family, so he was educated and was able to enter the army fairly early. And what we do know is, like many Celtic Catholic emigres, he prospered enough to join the army. And Blake saw service during the siege of Gibraltar and, in quotes, the American Revolution. And he was shining as an organizer in the 1770s, and he had been employed as a master, a trainer in cadet schools as a result of that.
Yeah, and then he becomes a lieutenant in 1783, and then captain in 1793. So he's fairly slowly working his way up the ranks, and he battles the French.
Yeah, he did. When the War of the First Coalition came out, it has a couple of names in Spain. They call it the War of the Pyrenees, the War of the Convention. When that breaks out, he was serving as a master of cadets at the Academy of Puerta de Santa Maria in Cadiz, and he left to join his regiment as a captain of grenadiers. This theater of the war, this War of the Pyrenees is very interesting because it shows us that if they were well led, the Spanish were still a force to be reckoned with, especially at this time. The commanding general was probably the last great Spanish general before the Peninsular War. His name was Antonio Ricardo, who is one of the outstanding military figures really in Spanish history at this point. And that war actually only began to go bad for the Spanish when he died. And Blake therefore saw action with his regiment under this figure, and he was wounded, and then he was again employed as a trainer in the volunteer regiment of Castilla. But people should look into the War of the Pyrenees because it's very interesting for the comparison.
It is, and neither army was supplied well, but it seems like it kind of went back and forth for a little while. Like there were Spanish victories and French victories.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So he eventually works his way up to general. So obviously he had some talent in 1808 within the Spanish army. And then during Napoleon's big invasion of Spain, he and Cuesta, who we're going to get to later, are defeated in the Battle of Medina del Rioseco.
Yep.
And I think that was under Marshal Bessier. And then later that year, he's defeated again by Marshal Lefebvre during Napoleon's big, where he's personally involved after, I believe, Balin. He says, all right, I'm going to get involved now.
Yeah.
And lead the army down there. And that was a tough loss for the Spanish because they had recaptured Madrid, and I guess Napoleon pushed them back out.
Yeah, they did. The early side of the Peninsular War is just, to use a British expression, bonkers. First of all, you have the French just utterly dominating everything. They win these early victories really easily, and then Balin happens, and it's just impossible for people to comprehend that an entire French army has just surrendered to the Spanish.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the French are repelled from the border fortresses. Yeah. And they actually have to all run for it behind the Ebro when Joseph abandons Madrid. So yeah, it's amazing period. Blake did have talent, definitely. Though I don't think he was ever particularly comfortable as a battlefield commander. He was also hamstrung, I think, by the politics. And so, for instance, when Blake's army of Galicia and Cuesta's army of Castile united, Blake was given secret instructions by the Junta of Galicia not to submit to Cuesta, even though Blake was junior to him in rank. And this is why the two commanders could not coordinate properly and resulted in it was really disastrous, the disaster at Medina del Rioseco. And Bessier just slapped them around the field.
Yeah.
Blake, despite that, Blake did show rare moments of tactical insight when an opportunity arose that kind of overcame his natural caution.
Yeah. He scored a victory against Marshal Victor, his advance guard under General Vilat at the Battle of Valmaseda. So he did have some successes here and there.
Yeah, definitely. And given the sparse resources that Spain had to use at the beginning of the war, he's definitely not untalented.
And just to touch on Balin again, I mean, that was kind of a shock across Europe that Napoleon's undefeated army could be defeated even though it was General Dupont, even though it was second-rate troops, it was still a large defeat, as you mentioned.
Yeah, the thing about it is that Dupont could have had, but yeah, they were second-rate troops, but that doesn't necessarily, to French minds, that didn't matter. Napoleon was appalled.
Yeah.
It didn't matter if they were garrison troops or what; they were still his soldiers. They were they were his eagles.
Yeah.
And General Castaños, which maybe we'll talk about in another episode.
Yeah.
He made the right calls.
But yeah, Dupont spent the rest of the empire sitting in a jail cell after that. So yeah, that was tough. In 1809, though, Blake, getting back to our protagonist, he scores a victory against Marshal Suchet at the Battle of Alcañiz, and that's kind of surprising because Suchet was one of the best generals at the time.
Yeah, Suchet is definitely a talented general. Although I think it's always useful to remember with Suchet that, firstly, people like to point him out as sort of a shining star because he became a marshal quite late. So he gets overshadowed, and people want to reveal him as the unsung hero of the marshalate.
Right.
So he gets overshadowed, and it's also very interesting that he won his baton in Spain, a place associated with disasters.
Right.
And that gives people the idea that he sort of alone knew what he was doing there, whereas everybody else didn't. However, on top of that, let's remember that he is the only French senior commander who never fought Wellington in open battle.
True.
So, in light of those considerations, I think any French marshal and most generals de division were technically a match for Blake. But the fact that he scores a victory off one of the most talented Suchet shows that he, like what we said before, he has moments even as an underdog, and the French overconfidence when fighting the Spanish just leads even the best of them to trip up, and I think Blake managed to take a limited advantage of that.
Yeah, and Blake was brave, no doubt. But like you were saying earlier, that the competing agendas of the juntas. We don't want our troops fighting for Galicia. We don't want our troops fighting for Cadiz or the different areas. There was a lot of that going on, I think, because there was no central command where, Napoleon was the central command for the French. So I think that was kind of an uphill battle for Blake.
Yeah, it was. I think so. We've mentioned the factionalism between the juntas, and they really undermined the generals. And I mean, the priority of the juntas was different. They were this. I mean, the civilian authorities, unfortunately, were calling the shots, and they all had different agendas.
Right.
So that didn't make things easy for the generals.
Yep. And in 1810, after many humbling defeats of the Spanish army under all of their generals, a general staff was created, and Blake participated and supported its creation, correct?
Yes, definitely. He was, like I say, he liked to train people, he liked to organize. This is very much a Blake idea.
Well, I think it's critical because they didn't really have a comprehensive battle plan before this. I think they were just kind of putting fingers in the dam wherever Napoleon's troops appeared.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So between 1809 and 1811, pretty much, the Spanish army kind of ceases to exist and has to be properly rebuilt.
Right.
And it just so happens that in this time, you're getting the French really kind of more occupied in trying to attack Portugal, which I guess gives them a bit of breathing space to try and think up some stuff.
Right. But at the same time, they have, there's local militias and, like you said earlier, guerrillas raiding, messengers and supply trains and that kind of thing.
Well, exactly. This is the point. Exactly. We were talking about it a little at the beginning. You get this is sort of like the end of the old royal army properly, and now you have the new army beginning to be formed again, and the general staff is a big step forward.
Yeah, and I think it produces fruit pretty quickly. In 1811, Blake fights alongside the British at the Battle of Albuera against Soult, a stiff battle. And although it was inconclusive, the Spanish under Blake really showed their mettle in that battle, correct?
They did, yeah. Albuera is a great achievement for the Spanish army. Blake was the commanding general of the Spanish forces and had successfully led his army to join Marshal Beresford. Apparently, Marshal Soult didn't know. I mean, by the way, also, we should say Soult gets a terrible reputation, but he was actually one of the best generals fighting in Spain. Yep. But with Blake, weirdly enough, it wasn't his personal direction, which is notable during the French attack. We should note that though he did get his men to where they needed to be, the tactics, the actual fighting, was down to General Zayas's brigade, which faced down 2 French divisions almost alone. And that was a big moment for the Spanish army.
Yeah, and I don't think Wellington, he wasn't at the scene of this battle, but he was none too pleased with what happened at Albuera.
Yeah.
But I believe the British government commended the Spanish after the battle, correct?
They did, yeah. Wellington specifically took issue with Beresford's state of mind after the battle. Beresford was very, very upset about the losses he had sustained, and he wrote this woeful dispatch, which Wellington said, "Do it again, write me a victory." Because he knew that you can't send disappointing news back to the government because they'll pull the funding, basically. But yeah, it worked because when news returned to Parliament, they offered a vote of thanks, which was typical. But as Beresford was the supreme commander in the field, he was also the marshal of the Portuguese army, the government felt that it was proper to acknowledge the role played by that of Spain as well. And Lord Liverpool moved at the house, in addition to the British and Portuguese troops, and I can quote, to highly approve and acknowledge the meritorious conduct, the skill and valor displayed by the Spanish army under the command of General Blake on the 16th of May last in the glorious Battle of Albuera. But again, this General Zayas and Ballesteros actually did most of the work, and actually Blake's performance in this battle is unclear and generally open to criticism.
Right. But I think just the fact that, in previous battles, the Spanish were either slaughtered, as you said, knocked around the field, but in this battle, they kind of stood their ground, regardless of who was the general. But I think Marshal Soult almost had Beresford, and that.
Oh, yeah. At the beginning, Zayas's brigade was the only thing stopping the French from just rolling right in to the rear of the British army, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that was just a critical, like I said, it was an inconclusive battle. Obviously Soult retreated, so I guess you could say the British held the field, but it was just good to see the Spanish, kind of, like you said earlier, rebuilding their army and having a good show in the field.
Mm-hmm.
So from there, I guess, Blake is alongside, the general staff, and obviously the French are evicted finally in 1813, 1814. And then once the peninsula is free, what happens to Blake? Does he have a career after the Napoleonic Wars?
Yeah, he lasts into the 1820s, and he holds several important military administrative positions, which he's pretty happy about. Mm-hmm. So he goes on after the Napoleonic Wars for a fair stretch.
Okay, and he passes in 1827. I just want to get your feeling. Do you think he was necessarily a bad general, or do you think he just lacked the troops, equipment, and supplies to win on a regular basis?
Maybe a bit of both. Blake was a good general in an organizational sense, and he seems to have been a reliable as an instructor.
Mm-hmm.
But although he won some small battles, his record shows that he's very cautious, sometimes indecisive, and the French were able to take advantage of this. So his battle record isn't great.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, it is entirely fair to point out that he didn't have any of the things you just mentioned really at the beginning, all of which would have increased his chances of a better battlefield performance.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's move on now to Gregorio García de la Cuesta, who was born to a northern Spanish family of lower nobility in 1741. What do we know about Cuesta? What was his early life like?
It's kind of fascinating. There's honestly very little written about his life between his joining the Guards in 1758 and his service in the War of the Pyrenees. Literally, everything I read up to this point, or had time to read, I should have, my bad if I didn't do my homework properly.
No
but
worries.
All the stuff that I read, basically, you'd think nothing happened.
Yeah. Well, he just kind of, like you said, he joins the Royal Guards in 1758, and then 1793 he's a lieutenant general in the War of the Pyrenees. So
yeah, there's just a yawning gap that nobody has cared to fill in all of the books that I have. I'm quite astounded that I couldn't find any. I'm tempted to say that means that he didn't see a shot fired in anger until 1793.
Maybe he was just on garrison duty that whole time. Who knows? But at the 1793 Battle of, I believe it's Couleur, he fights a masterful action, killing or wounding or capturing 4,000 French troops at the loss of only 300 of his own troops. So he must have had some talent early on.
Yeah, like we said earlier, people should really look at the operations of General Ricardo in this war and be comparing it to what followed in 1808. And Cuesta, commanded a division, I think, and both at army level and at divisional level, the Spanish used really quite technical and complicated maneuvers to fight the French. It's very difficult terrain in this part of the world.
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Lots of valleys and stuff, and rivers. And while Ricardo was alive, they were rewarded with successes like this, and it was a masterful action, and it shows that the Ancien Regime had a lot of talented generals who were just getting too old by the time Napoleon came around to really make an impression. And
Yeah,
Cuesta was one of these guys.
he wins again in 1795 at the Battle of Biscayne. So unfortunately, this seems to be the high point of his career.
Yeah, it seems that way. In hindsight, it looks like that, yeah. But at the time, actually, I think it probably seemed like the end of his career anyway.
Right.
Firstly, because of his age, and
Mhm.
secondly, due to the wider kind of disappointments being experienced by the Spanish army in that war. By this point, Ricardos had died on active service in 1794. Still a year to fight, and the French got the upper hand. And that battle was actually fought. I think after peace was
Yep.
agreed. It was
Yep.
one of those unfortunate battles that nobody knew they didn't have to fight.
Yeah, like the
And
New Orleans or the Battle of
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yep.
And Manuel Godoy, who was the chief minister at the time, didn't like Cuesta and was able to have him removed from command and block him from appointments pretty much until 1805. Cuesta's capable performance in the war with France did mean, though, that he was able to become president of the Council of Castile in 1796. But he was probably just setting himself up for retirement at that point.
Yeah, and then unfortunately, Napoleon invades Spain in 1808, and Cuesta is 67 years old at this time.
Yeah.
So probably his best years were behind him, but I guess they employed him because of his earlier successes against the French.
Probably, and the fact that he was just the senior Spanish general in the army at that time. I mean, in 1808, Cuesta, I think, was commander in chief in Old Castile, like captain general, I think.
Yeah, I read that he was reluctant to lead again, though. But I guess the crowd outside of his house erected a gallows. The partisans did, and basically they were indignant that he wouldn't command. So basically, it was, "You're going to be a general, we're going to hang you," which is kind of crazy.
I mean, that's a really fun story.
Yeah.
I'm a little skeptical about it.
Yeah.
This is from Omen, I think.
Oh, is that an Omen story? Okay.
I think so. I think that's where I found it.
Yeah.
When I looked it up.
Yeah.
And as a result, it can't easily be corroborated.
Yeah.
Now, Omen had a truly dim view of Cuesta. He called him a general of the old school, of the most, I think he said, unintelligent and brainless sort.
Oh, my.
And just from that sweeping judgment alone, I'm inclined to reject the idea he had to be threatened to serve.
Right.
Case in point, he was offered the post of Viceroy of New Spain by Joseph Bonaparte. And so that he was going to be given the rulership of Mexico.
Okay.
I mean, good luck with that, by the way, because the Spanish colonies are in uproar at the minute anyway. But for whatever reason, Cuesta turned it down flat.
Yeah, probably good.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a good move either way. But look at it this way. Cuesta knew the army inside out. He was in a high position. It allowed him a really wide view of what was going on. He didn't like it at all. So he knew there was an army of sorts, but he could see it was split up in districts. Funding was non-existent. The French already had effective control over the country. And he was a regular professional soldier. And nothing about the situation looked like a job for a regular professional soldier.
Yeah.
But it seems quite clear that he was also a patriot, and that the crowds more likely clamored for him to lead rather than threatened him.
Yeah.
And he agreed, and he recruits like 7,000 men to train up to be in his army.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting backstory there. His first engagement ends in a loss, but he finds success at Badajoz, correct?
He does, yeah. Cuesta had to call on immense levels of grit and determination, I think, between 1808 and 1809. His army was indeed defeated from the start, and when he joined forces with Blake, Marshal Bessier trounced them at Medina del Rioseco. Really bad defeat, that one. But Spain was saved by Castaños and Bailén and the defenses of Girona and all the cities. Why can't I remember the famous siege? The Maid of Saragossa. Yes, Saragossa.
Yep.
Stuff like that. But then, of course, Napoleon now personally intervenes.
Yeah.
Madrid falls,
Yep.
which in a weird way is actually kind of lucky for Cuesta, because in that interim,
Hmm.
after Bailen and stuff, he had tried to unify the army command and sort of like go over the heads of the quarreling juntas and place himself at the head of the army.
Mm.
But actually, that just got him arrested.
That didn't work out.
Yeah, so when Madrid fell, he became commander of the army of Estremadura, and yeah, he had some success in sort of clearing the house around Badajoz.
Yeah, no, he did well there, but then in March of 1809, he's defeated at Medellin against Victor.
Yeah,
He's pretty grievously wounded. Do you know what happened there?
yeah. So Cuesta was tasked to strike a blow against the French, and this suited him very well because he was by nature quite aggressive.
Hmm.
And so he met Victor, and he had superior infantry numbers but weaker cavalry and artillery.
Hmm.
And at Medellin, he decided to offset the enemy advantage in cavalry by stretching the line so that it was anchored between two rivers. And
Mm.
so it would be difficult to outflank, but very thin as a result. To offset that again, he apparently drew up his infantry in either 4 to 6 ranks deep to allow them to repel cavalry.
Hmm.
Now, think about this for a second. These are precautions you would only use if your men are quite poorly trained and
Right.
cannot conduct maneuvers under pressure, i.e., I don't think he thinks that they can form a square.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, see
That
what I
doesn't
mean?
speak highly of your troops, or at least your belief in your troops. Yeah.
Yeah, he's trying to. It's almost medieval. He's trying to basically allow them to do as little as possible and win. You know.
Mm.
But anyway, he advanced, and to everybody's surprise, actually, the Spanish infantry march forward bravely and begin repelling French counterattacks.
Hmm.
Um, the French skirmishers were completely overwhelmed by just these hordes of Spanish militiamen, I guess,
Yeah.
and even a cavalry charge was driven back. So it
Yeah.
seemed to be working. And
But
Victor may well have lost the battle,
right.
but his cavalry did make breakthroughs on the flanks, and he had much superior artillery, and they mauled those dense formations really badly. And when panic set in amongst the Spanish infantry, they just ran away en masse without hope of rallying. And
Yep.
like it was really open ground now, and it became a slaughterhouse, like 10,000 casualties or something like that.
Yeah. And
Cuesta
but
was shot in the foot.
yeah, and then trampled by cavalry
Yeah,
or
he was
something.
trampled and concussed, and his nephews, I think, and his British liaison officer, General Durbin, had to rescue him. So,
Ah,
yeah.
yeah, that's terrible. Well, I guess he recuperates from there because he joins forces with the British Army under the Duke of Wellington, but relations with the Duke are, I'll just say, icy, or just not cordial, I should say.
Icy is fair enough. Icy and not too cordial is fairly accurate, I think.
Well, I get both sides of this argument though, because Wellington's there. He's like, look, we're here trying to win this battle for you, but you're not supplying us. But then Cuesta's probably thinking, well, I can barely supply my own troops.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? This is exactly the point. The Spanish are just not capable of supplying the British at this time. Not even the French can supply themselves
Right.
in this part of the country.
Yeah.
And the British just completely failed to understand that not only the time frame was much longer for adequate supplies to be gathered, but the valley of the Tagus, like where the Talavera campaign was fought, was a
Mhm.
poor region even before it had been pillaged.
Right.
So I think this is an unavoidable problem. Um, and it was actually, I really think it was much less a matter of supplies that made things difficult, but the conflicting personalities of Wellesley, as he was then, just
Mhm.
before Talavera, and
Yeah.
Cuesta, neither of whom trusted the other, nor was there a practical basis to do so. The British had the lowest possible opinion of the Spanish, and the Spanish felt the British were just essentially there to loot their towns and run away whenever the
Right.
French advanced, like they had
Right.
under Moore at Coruña.
Correct.
So, it was a miracle this campaign happened at all, let alone, that the Allies survived it.
Yeah, and later Wellington was furious when he heard Cuesta had abandoned injured British soldiers. Do you know what happened there?
I mean, it's all well and good for Wellington to complain that Cuesta abandoned the wounded,
Mhm.
but I mean, Wellington, that's probably Wellington's guilty conscience's play, because it was his decision to leave his wounded in the care of the Spaniards,
Right,
knowing full well the state of the Spanish army,
right,
which he had complained at length about for the entirety of the campaign. Cuesta, for his part, was not he wasn't an unfeeling monster, but he was unable to prosecute the campaign after Wellington retreated to Portugal.
right.
And Cuesta was just as furious at being abandoned as Wellington was at Spanish inefficiency. The British
Ye-
had gone away again.
Yeah, now hearing you talk about it, I can see why it took 6 years to evict the French.
Yeah, exactly.
Just the Spanish didn't trust the British, the Portuguese didn't trust the Spanish, and it was just it sounds like a lot of distrust all around on the Allied side.
Oh, massive distrust. It takes them ages to get a working kind of practical alliance going, rather than just a sort of a bunch of independent people fighting the same enemy.
Right, right. And in 1810, I guess our friend Cuesta suffers a stroke, and what happens to this guy?
Well, he dies. I think it's in 1811, and he sort of fades from memory because he dies in the middle of the war,
Mm-hmm.
and so he gets overshadowed by everybody else. And then he gets character assassinated by the British. He is the archetype useless Spaniard, and that has been his reputation for a very long time.
But that may be, he might have been a hopelessly proud, arrogant guy. But what are your overall thoughts on it? It sounds like he kind of knew what he was doing, at least in the War of the Pyrenees. Like he has military talent. It just sounds like again, same thing with Blake. He just didn't have the supplies or the troops or the abilities to fight the French off.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. In a weird way, I actually think he was a more capable all-round commander than Blake.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of weird to say, because unlike Blake, he didn't actually win any sort of notable battles against the French in this war.
Yeah.
Except Talavera, he can claim some credit with Talavera because his men were in the field there as well. But no, I agree with Charles Esdale, who rates him as one of the top Spanish generals, just because he's so experienced, he knows what he's doing, and he's completely hamstrung from doing what he wants to do.
Yeah.
By the political situation.
And dealing with Wellington is also very prideful and.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a fan of Wellington myself, but there's no doubting you had to play his game. You had to play it his way.
Mm-hmm.
And Cuesta wanted, obviously. I mean, you can't put Cuesta. He's concussed. He's limping. He's got an army. He can't really properly command because of his own political masters, and he's got this young British general telling him what he's supposed to do with his army.
Right. Right. The egos, not only those two men, but all the supporting generals of Wellington and all the supporting generals of Cuesta. There's a lot of egos in the room.
Definitely.
Yeah, sounds like not a lot of cooperation going on. But hey, in the end, it worked out, and the French were evicted. It just took longer, probably, than anyone wanted it to.
Yeah, and the Spanish army by no means is one of the best armies, regular armies in the Peninsular War or anything or even the Napoleonic Wars, but it has been given such a bad reputation without context by most British authors, who just parrot back a lot of the sort of xenophobic ideas and critical ideas that the British had at the time, which is quite unfair given what they had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, they had no head of government. They were undersupplied. There was probably no money coming to them. I mean, the central bank was in shambles. So I don't know. I feel bad for the Spanish army. They fought bravely. Sometimes they were well led. Sometimes they were poorly led. But it seems to me they fought bravely throughout the Peninsular War.
They did. And if we do any more episodes about Spanish generals, maybe we'll get into how they do, later in the later war.
Yeah. The later campaign, 1813,
Yeah.
1814. Sure. Well, I think this was very informative. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I do want to give a shout out one more time for Adventures in Historyland on YouTube and Twitter. I recommend everyone check it out. And Josh, I appreciate you coming on the show.
No, I was very happy to be invited. It's really, really fun show.
Yeah, anytime. I appreciate the time and hope to have you on back soon.
I will come back anytime. Thank you so much.